Today, I'm going to talk about war. And unfortunately, war has always been around, perhaps as long as we've had recorded history. But like us, war hasn't always been the same. It's evolved. From sticks and stones to bows and arrows to eventually nuclear warfare, we've kind of seen it all. And amongst all of that, there was one type of warfare that I found very interesting and I wanted to share with you today. It's called trench warfare and was fought mainly on the Western Front in World War I. Welcome to Vlogs of Knowledge. World War I was one of the biggest wars that we've had in the last century. It is called World War I. It was very violent, it was very brutal, and produced many casualties, but they really do a good job of justifying those casualties. Now, the usual nature of war is that you go and you invade your enemy to try to get some of their territory. And of course, along the way, you are going to lose some men. It's kind of inevitable. But those deaths, well, they are kind of justified because you are making territorial progress. And one of the ways that you could tell how good you were doing in a war is by looking at how much territory you've gained. Think of the Roman Empire, the huge expansion that they had. Of course, they lost a lot of men, but those men were justified because of the huge territorial gain that they had. And now looking back at World War I, well, the casualties were there, but the territorial gain, it was not. Those casualties were not justified. The soldiers kind of just stood there and died, at least on the Western Front. Now that's a pretty confusing statement, and I understand. Why did the soldiers just sit there and die? Well, for that we have to get a little context. World War I was started in 1914. This was the beginning of the 20th century and technology had increased exponentially. More specifically, weapons technology had increased. Because of new weapons, it was now really easy to kill massive amounts of people in very little time with very little bullets. It made the traditional charge your opponent head-on strategy kind of obsolete. If you did that, you were going to die. So instead of going on the offensive, they chose to stay in and remain on the defensive. And that's really when we started seeing trenches in World War I. As soon as generals, they realized that charging head-on would be a deadly approach, they ordered their men to dig trenches. Now a trench is a long and narrow ditch that the soldiers dug themselves, and then they installed their equipment, their guns, and whatever else they might need for the war. Trenches were very good. They were a very good defense against the opponent. If the opponent couldn't see you because you were underground, well, he couldn't shoot you. But the problem was that both sides went on the defensive, and so nobody was really doing an attack. And that's what we call a stalemate, the stalemate of World War I. And because you couldn't really do an offensive attack, well, you had to kind of come up with a new strategy. And so generals, they thought, and they came up with the strategy of wearing the opponent down. Basically, it became a game of who can last the longest. And now you can understand why there were so many casualties without the territorial gain to justify them. Trenches became very elaborate. Soldiers set up their camp, their weapons, and everything else they might need for the war. Each side had their own trench system, and it was separated by an area in the middle called no man's land. Now, to give you an idea of no man's land, how small it was usually no bigger than 250 yards. So you can kind of imagine that the trenches were very close to each other. Now, soldiers, they would typically avoid no man's land, which is understandable. If you're caught there, you're pretty much guaranteed to be killed. If you did have to leave the trench or go into no man's land, you would usually do it at night. At night, there's less light and your chances of being seen are decreased. So now that we know what trenches are, I do hope that you want to know what life was like in these trenches. What was it like to be a soldier in World War I? Contrary to what you might expect, it was kind of boring, at least during the day. During the day, there was not much that you could do. Besides cleaning guns or being on the lookout, you pretty much just stood there. It was usually at night that they would go out of the trenches, dig some more, or maybe even cross no man's sky. But during the day, well, nothing really. Soldiers would be in trenches for days, sometimes weeks at a time, with very little to do. And on top of that, you couldn't even sleep because of the guns, the bombs, or whatever else might wake you up. This was war. Trenches were not protected against the rain or the cold, and because of that, a lot of soldiers had to be amputated, either by frostbite or something called trencher's foot. Now, trencher's foot is something that you get when you're exposed to wetness for a long period of time, and if your leg gets infected, well, you have to amputate it if you don't treat it. And on top of that, you had rats. Now, rats were a problem for two reasons. Either as a soldier, they would eat your food, or you could wake up in the middle of the night and you had 10 rats eating your flesh. It can be a good experience. But perhaps the worst thing that could happen to you in a trench as a soldier was to hear your general give the order to cross no man's land and go into enemy territory. You knew you were going to die. The chances of survival were pretty much non-existent. But soldiers didn't always cross no man's land. There was a lot of other things to do. You could set up a new camp, you could bring in new weapons, or you could dig new trenches. And to deal with the opponent, there were other strategies. You could use grenades or you could use a poison gas. Grenades were good. You could throw them from a distance and they would inflict big damage in a short amount of time. Poison gas was even worse because on top of killing the opponent, you also had the element of fear. Just think about it. If you were a soldier in a trench and you saw a gas canister coming near you with the green gas coming out, you had to run because if you didn't run, well, you were going to die. Now, contrary to what people might think, trench warfare was not fought everywhere in World War I. It was only fought in the Western Front, and that was because of the geographical position of the countries that were fighting. Now, on the Western Front, compared to the Eastern Front, you had a lot less space to fight, which made sense to build trenches. I mean, you had to go on the defensive. But on the Eastern Front, well, that didn't exist. You had a lot more mobility, and so they did not build trenches. And then as World War I went on, tanks were introduced, and Germany was focusing on the Eastern Front, so they were kind of okay with letting the stalemate in the Western Front. But eventually, after the war, trenches kind of just died. So with that being said, thanks for watching. Alright, that was it for this week's episode of Vlogs of History. I really do hope that you've enjoyed it and that maybe you've learned something. If you did, please leave a like, share it to a friend, and subscribe to be notified when the next episode comes out. Remember that these episodes come out every single Monday, and if you missed the previous one, there's a link on your screen. If not, there's a link in the description. Make sure to check it out. As always, I'm your host, Darius Cousin. It's been an absolute pleasure. You can follow me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever. I'm always active. With that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next week.